Beneath the polished facades of America's state hospitals, another history was written. Not one of cures, but of silence. Behind locked doors, children were drugged into visions. Soldiers returned as strangers to their families. Women's bodies were claimed as instruments in experiments they had never chosen. What began as sanctuaries of healing slowly hardened into laboratories of cruelty. Their secrets lay buried in ledgers, in shredded records, and in the forgotten corridors that still breathe with memory. Tonight we open those doors once more. We follow the trails of hidden experiments, the erased names, and the restless ghosts that still cling to the walls of institutions long abandoned, yet never erased. Before we begin, tell us where in the world are you watching from and what time is it for you now? And if you wish to keep uncovering the darkest truths history tried to bury, be sure to subscribe to Gothic Ledger. The story you are about to hear is not a tale of medicine, but of memory. And the price of forgetting is always paid in silence. In the middle years of the 20th century, America's state hospitals rose like monuments of reassurance. Their brick facades glowed with civic pride. Their lawns, perfectly manicured, gave the impression of peace. Tall arched windows caught the sunlight, as if promising transparency. To the public eye, they were symbols of progress. Places where the afflictions of the mind might finally meet science rather than shame. Hope was choreographed with precision, performed for all who came to look. Newspapers praised a new kind of physician, Dr. Walter Freeman. His name stretched across the nation like a banner of salvation. Photographs staged with care showed him in commanding profile, the tilt of his head confident, his surgical instruments gleaming at his side, the promise that broken families could at last be mended within these walls. In his presence, the future seemed impatient, leaning forward, ready to deliver cures that could unshackle generations. It was under this banner of hope that Rosemary arrived. A modest housewife, she had slipped quietly into melancholy after years bound within the confines of domestic life. Neighbors whispered of her nervous exhaustion. Her husband, burdened with the weight of appearances, sought out the hospital with the faith one might give to a cathedral. The forms were signed with relief, not suspicion. The institution promised restoration after all, and on the surface, it fulfilled that promise. Bright corridors stretched into vanishing points. Polished tile echoed with the clipped rhythm of nurses' steps. Visitors were ushered past orderly wards where patients sat calmly, neatly aligned in rows. Every detail was arranged to suggest order and benevolence. But the facade was fragile, held together by appearances. Beyond certain locked doors, scenes no camera ever captured gathered like sediment at the bottom of a dark well. Dr. Freeman's philosophy was shaped as much by efficiency as by compassion. He dreamed not simply of treatment but of transformation. Entire populations made suddenly manageable. To him, the hospital was a laboratory where the failures of traditional medicine could be overturned with daring interventions. Rosemary, like so many others, was absorbed into this vision. She ceased to exist as a woman carrying sorrow and was rewritten into a specimen awaiting cure. The optimism was intoxicating, but it concealed deep dissonance. Behind glowing press releases, patients whispered of cold wards and endless scrutiny. Nurses carried out their routines with mechanical precision, Yet, in their private journals, when those journals survived, they confessed unease experiments conducted at a speed no one could question. For every shining success story, there were dozens of silences recorded only as unresponsive or declined further treatment. Rosemary believed she would leave those walls renewed. Instead, she was consumed by the machinery of progress. The very facades that had promised deliverance became barriers holding her inside as tightly as any prison. What appeared as healing was in truth the opening of a door from which return was uncertain. The asylum's promises were spoken with sincerity, but sincerity cannot defend against what festers in silence. The doctor still smiled for the papers. The buildings still gleamed. Families still handed over their loved ones with gratitude. But beneath it all, the first shadows had already taken root. To the public, the asylum remained a symbol of mercy and order. The main entrance opened into wide reception halls, floors shining administrators eager to assure visitors of progress. Yet, beyond those polished thresholds, the shape of the place shifted. The air grew heavier. Corridors stretched longer. Silence settled like a physical weight. And it is through the surviving journal of Nurse Margaret Chen that this contrast becomes clear. Her entries, written in the deliberate hand of someone who knew the danger of being overheard, revealed a world few outsiders ever imagined. By day, she followed the expected routines, charting medicines, escorting families on brief tours, reciting well-practiced lines of reassurance. By night, she wrote what she could never say aloud. In her pages, the words appeared stripped of humanity. Patients reduced to numbers, their histories cut down to clipped fragments of diagnosis. One figure appeared again and again. Patient 47. He had entered the hospital decades earlier, committed as a teenager, for what was then called nervous instability. By the time Chen met him, his hair had whitened, his words had withered to mutters, and no record of family remained. His existence had narrowed to habit-fed, washed return to his iron bed, forgotten even by those tasked to care for him. It was on the night shifts that the deepest fractures revealed themselves. When the hospital's public face slept, the wards became arenas of unchecked authority. Chen described attendants moving through the corridors with keys rattling like chains, their voices sharp in the silence. Patients were restrained not for violence, but for inconvenience. Cries in the dark were ignored or silenced with a blow or with an injection. Administrators never recorded such acts. To the outside world, they never existed at all. Her journal also spoke of strange rituals that grew in these hours. Patients whispered in the shadows, trading rumors about those who vanished after being summoned for special observation. Staff explained the disappearances as transfers or recoveries, but no one ever returned. Chen wrote of the dread that spread through the wards whenever footsteps echoed near the grim understanding that survival depended less on treatment than on remaining invisible. Most chilling of all was the way her tone shifted. Over time, Chen described cruelty with detachment as though she too had been trained into silence. The asylum demanded compliance from everyone who entered, whether confined by diagnosis or bound by employment. To the community outside the hospital still gleamed as a pillar of hope. Families left its gates believing they had chosen compassion. But within its walls, Chen's words recorded the erosion of humanity. Corridors patrolled like prison blocks. Men and women reduced to numbers, lives quietly erased in the margins of official reports. They came in pursuit of healing. Yet when the doors closed, all that remained was endurance. The institution guarded its secrets well until the journal surfaced, pulling back the veil on the shadows routine had concealed. In the history of America's state hospitals, the walls themselves were rarely the first instruments of confinement. The true barrier was never the walls of the asylum, but the papers that sealed its doors. Documents stamped in haste, signed by officials who rarely looked beyond the names printed before them. It was in this narrow space between law and convenience that countless lives were lost to silence. Judge Harold Morrison became the favored ally of administrators for his efficiency. Hearings took minutes. Testimonies were reduced to fragments. Verdicts were delivered without pause. Families arrived with petitions framed not as punishments but as relief. A wife spoke of her husband's temper. A son worried about his mother's confusion. Neighbors whispered of impropriety. Morrison nodded, signed, and within hours, the patient was gone, committed before they had the chance to protest. The Brennan family's story reveals the machinery at work. In the early 1920s, Margaret Brennan was declared morally unstable, a phrase vague enough to cover anything and precise enough to ensure her removal. No act of violence, no threat. Only the weary testimony of a husband tired of her melancholy. Within weeks, she was locked in a ward where she would remain for decades. Her daughter Catherine followed soon after, branded with hereditary weakness, before she even turned 18. No crime, alleged only the fear that her mother's tendencies might repeat. By mid-century, Catherine's son, the third generation, was confined under the same suspicion, though his only offense was truancy and restlessness. The Brennan name itself became institutional property, absorbed into ledgers as though their lives beyond the hospital had never existed. In the files, freedom vanished in the margins of paperwork. Morrison's signature appears again and again, a scrawl repeated, until it lost all individuality. In his courtroom, there was no defense, no challenge. Once the pen moved, the doors closed, and silence followed. Nurse Chen's journal decades later mentions the Brennan family, only in passing old family, been here forever. Inside, they were not seen as tragedy, but as fixtures as ordinary as peeling paint or worn tiles. The permanence of the documents was the deeper cruelty. Once filed, release was nearly impossible. Reviews were perfunctory, often overseen by the same judges who had ordered the commitment. Each signature justified the one before. Across the country, thousands disappeared this way, efficient for administrators, respectable for families, and for the patients. The quiet erasure of autonomy, written in ink. The brittle records of the Brennan family illustrate the invisible mechanism that kept the asylum system alive. The walls contain the bodies, but the papers imprisoned the lives. And once signed, those documents proved harder to escape than any lock. By mid-century, Dr. Walter Freeman had become more than a physician. He was a traveling spectacle, moving from hospital to hospital with a leather case containing his most infamous instrument, a long, slender pick, little different from the kind found in kitchens. He called it innovation. To the public, he was a visionary, dismantling madness. To those who witnessed the aftermath, it was something else entirely. Freeman performed demonstrations in auditoriums where medical staff gathered with a reverence closer to theater than science. He spoke of liberation, of slicing through suffering with precision. His audience listened as though each phrase contained salvation. Then he would take the patient restrained compliant or too weary to resist and press the pick against the fragile bone above the eye. A sharp strike of the mallet drove steel into the mind's hidden chambers. Among his youngest subjects was Howard Dully. Just 12 years old, he never understood the reasons that placed him on Freeman's table. His stepmother found him difficult, resistant to her rules, prone to disobedience. Freeman accepted her words without question. In his notes, Howard became a set of problems to be solved. The boy's own voice was never recorded. The procedure lasted minutes. The pick inserted, swiveled with practiced gestures, then withdrawn. Freeman declared that he had cut the knots of anxiety, unraveled the threads of defiance. But what returned to Howard's family was not a cure. His curiosity, his energy, his stubborn spark, all were gone, replaced by a vacancy that could never be undone. To hospital boards burdened by overcrowding, Freeman's travels seemed like deliverance. Wards grew quiet. Beds were freed. Families reassured themselves that progress was real, but the cost was etched in faces stripped of light. Children once spirited became shadows inhabiting bodies no longer their own. Howard would later remember only fragments, a sense of something taken from him before he could name it. His childhood ended not with age, but with intrusion. Steel had entered the fragile space between his eye and brain. What remained was not peace, but absence. The ice pick itself became a symbol of Freeman's philosophy. Ordinary, domestic, almost harmless in appearance, yet devastating in the hands of unchecked authority. He proved that horror required no elaborate machinery. It demanded only belief, an audience eager to applaud, and a patient with no power to refuse. The procedure was praised as efficient, even humane. But the records tell another story. Youth dismantled, thought severed, innocence erased with the strike of metal against bone. Electricity, too once synonymous with progress, found new purpose behind asylum doors. What had illuminated cities and powered industry was turned inward into the human body as a cure. Electroconvulsive therapy, imported under the influence of Dr. Ugo Celletti, was hailed as modern medicine's victory over despair. The idea was simple: induce seizures under controlled conditions, and perhaps the mind could be reset, its disturbances erased by current. The practice spread quickly. Machines appeared in hospital basements, their dials adjusted with the detachment of technicians in a laboratory. Patients were gathered, restrained, electrodes pressed to temples with clinical precision. A switch flipped. Voltage surged. Bodies stiffened. Jaws locked. Silence gave way to the crack of teeth grinding against bone. Administrative reports recorded these not as suffering but as progress. The name Sarah Mitchell appears again and again in the files. At 34, she was admitted for persistent sorrow and fatigue. Her husband, persuaded by physicians, consented without hesitation. Her first shock was in 1947. Notes described a marked convulsion and temporary calm. The cycle repeated until she had endured 47 sessions. To administrators, the treatment was thorough. To her family, it was devastating. Memories slipped away, birthdays, forgotten children, unrecognized, the rhythm of life dissolved into confusion. She smiled at strangers as though they were kin, and looked straight through her husband as though he had never been part of her story. The treatment had not erased despair so much as it had erased her very tether to the life she once lived. Inside hospital walls, Sarah's case was noted as exemplary. Charts coolly recorded satisfactory response and reduction of agitation. Silence in the institution's language equaled success. Yet, when her children came on weekends, they left shaken. They returned home describing a mother who no longer remembered their names, who greeted them with polite nods, as though they were visitors, not her own blood. The cruelty did not come through visible violence, but through its disguise as benevolence. Families were told the shocks were essential, that memory loss was a side effect, outweighed by stability. They watched as their loved ones returned, altered and hollow, and yet were reassured that this absence was progress. The language of treatment smoothed devastation into statistics. Electroshock endured for decades, refined but never abandoned. Defenders insisted it was humane compared to the brutal alternatives. Yet, the archival record reveals a different pattern, an erasure not of illness, but of identity. Sarah Mitchell's life was split cleanly into before and after, a testament to what electricity could take as much as what it could offer. Her hospital file closes with no ceremony. The final note reads, "Patient unresponsive to further treatment." The record ends their leaving her family to endure the vacancy left behind. In the silence between the shocks, they had not lost her sorrow. They had lost her. Among the arsenal of 20th century asylum practices, few carried such hidden danger as insulin shock therapy. Imported from Europe and championed by Dr. Manfred Sakel, it was hailed as revolutionary, a way to drive madness into retreat by plunging patients into repeated comas. Simple in description, brutal in practice, it relied on heavy doses of insulin that collapsed blood sugar levels. Seizures followed, then unconsciousness. Nurses hovered over still bodies as though watching clocks wind down. After an hour, sometimes longer, sugar water or adrenaline was forced in to bring the patient back. Not everyone returned. One such patient was Thomas Kirkbride, a young jazz pianist committed in the 1930s for what physicians called nervous instability. His file mentions late nights, unpredictable energy, and a temperament considered unsuitable for steady employment. To fellow musicians, however, he was a genius. His improvisations spiraled into brilliance. To the hospital, he was an experiment. Kirkbride's first insulin coma passed with little explanation. Notes described initial agitation, then collapse. His hands, once lightening across the keys, trembled uncontrollably when he awoke. Nurses dismissed it as expected adjustment. The treatments continued. By the 10th session, his speech fragmented. By the 20th, he could no longer recall melodies he himself had written. The therapy meant to restore him stripped away the very talent that defined him. Surviving staff accounts suggest these sessions carried the rhythm of ritual. Patients strapped to gurneys, needles inserted, attendants waiting for consciousness to fade. In private, some wagered quietly on who would return, who would not. The line between treatment and cruelty blurred, masked by the sterile vocabulary of medicine. Dr. Sakel himself preached certainty, that madness could be shocked into submission, that comas could reset the brain. His confidence spread across hospitals, desperate for answers, and the practice flourished. But for every patient recorded as improved, others like Kirkbride dwindled. Session by session, vitality drained. When his file was closed, he was no longer the man who had entered. His music had vanished into silence, his fingers now clumsy, his eyes vacant. The institution did not mark this as failure but as necessary risk in pursuit of advancement. Families were told their loved ones had received the best modern care. The charts filled with shorthand that reduced human loss to abbreviations. Kirkbride's name appears only in fragments. His music, once alive in smoky clubs and crowded dance halls, disappeared from the record. What remained was silence heavier than diagnosis. A brilliance muted, surrendered to the promise of cure. Water long, a symbol of renewal, and purification was also twisted into a weapon within asylum walls. Hydrotherapy, first introduced to calm agitation, evolved into something harsher, a method of control. What began as immersion for comfort became immersion for silence. The practice appeared simple. Patients were stripped and lowered into porcelain tubs filled with lukewarm water. Straps bound their arms and legs. Canvas sheets pressed them down. At first, baths lasted minutes. Soon they stretched into hours, then nights. Records describe bodies left submerged until skin, wrinkled nails softened, and consciousness dulled into resignation. Administrators called it therapeutic rest. Nurses called it routine. Among those submerged was Mary O'Sullivan, a devout woman committed in the 1930s for what her file described as religious preoccupation and intrusive confession. She spoke constantly of sins. She could not banish her conscience, restless to exhaustion. The asylum's answer was water. She was placed in the tub, held down for hours. Logs recorded her as quiet, following prolonged bath. The phrase repeated for weeks, then months. One attendant. James Murphy emerges in hidden notes as both ordinary and chilling. His duty was to tighten straps, maintain temperature, and record compliance. For him, immersion was not cruelty, it was procedure. Yet Chen's private notes describe how Murphy sometimes left patients submerged well beyond prescription, unmoved by pleas or trembling. For him, hydrotherapy blurred into punishment masked as care. Mary's confessions born from anguish were treated as symptoms to be washed away. Each bath was meant to cleanse the mind, but the result resembled drowning without death. She emerged pale, weaker, quieter, not from relief, but depletion. The hospital called this progress. Soon entire wards were outfitted with continuous baths, rows of patients suspended in water day and night. The faint splash of restrained bodies and the hiss of dripping faucets became the ward's soundtrack. Visitors rarely saw these rooms. Administrators found them practical. Water was cheaper than medicine. Silence simpler than struggle. In records, hydrotherapy looks almost benign. Patient calm, patient resting. Absent are the hours of restraint. The skin blistered by damp canvas. The whispered prayers dissolving into steam. Water, once a sacred purifier, was weaponized not to kill but to subdue. Mary O'Sullivan's file ends without mention of release. Her final entry after years of immersion reads only condition stabilized. In asylum logic, silence meant cure and submission was the ultimate sign of healing. Perhaps the most chilling chapter of asylum history is not found in the baths or shock rooms, but in the quiet corridors of public health policy. By the early 20th century, eugenics had reshaped American institutions into factories of prevention. Poverty, mental illness, even disobedience were classified as hereditary stains unfit for future generations. At the forefront was Dr. Harry Laughlin, who turned theory into law. From his office, he drafted model legislation, granting hospitals the power to sterilize those deemed unfit. His tone was detached, his language clinical. He spoke of protecting society, reducing taxpayer burdens, ensuring weakness would not multiply. His rhetoric masked reality: human beings reduced to defective lines in a ledger, their futures erased without consent. Carrie Buck became the most infamous casualty of this crusade. A young woman confined to the Virginia colony for epileptics and feeble-minded, she was accused of immorality and weakness. In truth, she had been a foster child exploited for labor, later condemned after pregnancy born of abuse. Instead of protection, she was branded liability. Her case would rise all the way to the Supreme Court in 1927. The verdict, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, gave the highest legal sanction to sterilization. After that ruling, the practice accelerated. Hospitals adopted routines that resembled assembly lines. Patients were summoned from their wards, placed under anesthesia, and sterilized in operations that lasted less than an hour. Men were cut. Women were opened. When they awoke, there was no explanation, only the assurance that they had been treated. Their ability to bear children had been erased. Their lives permanently altered without their knowledge. Records from the 1930s and 1940s reveal staggering numbers. Tens of thousands were sterilized, many of them young women confined for so-called promiscuity or waywardness. Others were men whose only crime was poverty or low scores on tests. Annual reports presented rising figures as if they were signs of productivity charts filled with numbers that administrators praised as progress. Behind each statistic, however, was a body altered, a future stolen. Inside the wards, patients whispered about the surgery. Some believed it was a cure. Others feared it was punishment. Most never knew the truth until it was too late. Survivors would later describe how their marriages collapsed when they discovered they could not conceive how entire communities quietly carried the scar of missing generations. Yet, in the official language of the institutions, these wounds were counted as victories, contributions to public welfare. The machinery of sterilization did not demand cruelty from any single individual. It required only compliance. Doctors followed the law, judges signed the orders, nurses assisted without question. Each step was justified as scientific necessity. Together they created a system where thousands were erased not by death, but by the denial of lineage. Carrie Buck lived long enough to see the practice discredited. But her own ability to bear children had already been stolen. Her case remains a stark reminder that the asylum was not only a place of confinement, but also of endings, written quietly in the absence of those who might have been born. In the quietest wings of the asylum, the smallest patients carried the heaviest burdens. Wards designed for children were decorated in cheerful terms: therapeutic playrooms, developmental programs. Yet their true purpose emerges only through the surviving fragments of records. Behind locked doors, childhood itself was transformed into material for experiment. Dr. Loretta Bender became one of the most prominent figures in this hidden chapter. Celebrated in psychiatric circles for her work on childhood schizophrenia, she pursued chemical methods to unlock the mysteries of behavior. To her children, represented an unmarked canvas minds. pliant, untouched by decades of illness, and ideal for testing new compounds. Among the substances introduced into these wards was lysergic acid diethylamide LSD, a drug capable of altering perception in ways even adults struggle to endure. One file tells of Timothy, age 6. His admission was justified under the vague diagnosis of developmental delay, a phrase that offered no clear boundaries. Placed under Bender's program, he was given daily doses of LSD in the name of observation. The logs recorded his responses in clinical shorthand: increased activity, visual disturbance, marked withdrawal. Nowhere do the notes acknowledge what those sessions meant for a child whose only wish was to play. Accounts describe Timothy seated before blocks and toys, his eyes fixed not on the objects, but on visions conjured by the drug. At times, he laughed at empty air. At others, he screamed without explanation. Nurses instructed to remain detached wrote only of his reactions, never of his suffering. Playtime dissolved into experiment, and his childhood into a series of hallucinations. The ward itself carried an unsettling atmosphere. Long corridors muted by linoleum air, thick with antiseptic silence, broken by sudden bursts of laughter or cries that seemed to erupt without cause. Visitors rarely entered these spaces. When they did, they saw children engaged in what appeared to be activity, unaware that the games were guided not by imagination, but by chemicals and observation. Bender defended her work as progress. She argued that controlled disruption of perception might reveal the hidden patterns of illness. To administrators eager for innovation, her experiments brought prestige. But for Timothy and others like him, the result was disorientation, fear, and the slow erosion of what it meant to be a child. Innocence was replaced by visions too complex, too terrifying for a 6-year-old to endure. The tragedy of these wards lies in their invisibility. Families placed trust in the institution, convinced that treatment was both necessary and humane. Reports sent home described therapeutic exercises and behavioral adjustments. The truth remained buried for decades, sealed inside files, stamped confidential, and locked away in archives. Timothy's name, once carefully noted in logs, eventually faded into silence. Whether he left the institution or remained behind its walls into adulthood is never revealed. What lingers instead are pages capturing a stolen childhood, clinical entries where laughter and terror became indistinguishable, and where blocks and toys gathered dust while syringes dictated the rhythm of his days. The history of medical progress often hides the very bodies upon which it was built. In the mid-19th century, Dr. J. Marion Sims rose to prominence as a celebrated pioneer of gynecology. His name would later be etched into textbooks and monuments. Yet beneath the title of father of modern gynecology lies a legacy of brutal experimentation carried out on women who had no power to refuse. The name that appears most often in this shadowed record is Anaka. She was only a teenager enslaved when Sims began his surgical trials on her in the 1840s. Suffering complications from childbirth, she became the relentless focus of his ambition. Over several years, Sims performed at least 30 experimental operations on her. Each one was driven not by her healing, but by his determination to perfect a surgical method. Anaka endured every procedure without anesthesia, for Sims claimed wrongly that black women experienced pain differently. That conviction gave him license to cut again and again. The silence surrounding these procedures was deliberate. The women, Anaka, Betsy Lucy, and others were enslaved. Their consent was irrelevant in a system that reduced them to property. Their agony was translated into clinical shorthand patient-tolerated procedure. Patients survived. Their cries of pain were never preserved as testimony. Their voices rose only in private rooms where no official record would ever listen. Within asylums and hospital wards of that era, women's bodies were often subjected to the same indifference. Diagnoses like hysteria or moral insanity justified invasive interventions. Uterine surgeries, clitoridectomies, experimental drugs. These were prescribed with confidence, while women themselves were dismissed as unreliable narrators of their own suffering. The notes show a grim pattern. Symptoms minimized pain, reframed as exaggeration, silence imposed as order. Yet, even in these suffocating spaces, resistance flickered. Surviving fragments of testimony recall whispered exchanges between patients. Women warned one another which doctors to fear, which procedures to endure in silence, which nurses might show rare mercy. These fragile networks carried no power to halt the machinery of experimentation, but they preserved dignity in the margins of captivity. Anaka's endurance became the cornerstone of Sims's career. His perfected surgical technique would one day win him fame across Europe and America. Yet the cost of that success was borne by women who never consented, who were never credited, and who were systematically erased from the official narrative. Their bodies were transformed into instruments of progress, their suffering institutionalized, then forgotten. The same pattern endured well into the 20th century. Women admitted to asylums for depression defiance or simple disobedience found themselves subjected to procedures they never chose. Their files read like factory reports treatment administered patient stable. Pain vanished from the page not because it was absent, but because the institution had the power to declare it irrelevant. Anaka lived into her 40s, scarred and marked by years of involuntary surgery. Her legacy is not carved into Sims's monuments, but into the recognition long delayed that her silence was forced and her suffering foundational to medicine's advance. The operating table became her only voice, and history listened only to the man who stood above it. Decades later, when soldiers returned from war, they were expected to slip back into ordinary life. Families gathered at train stations, children clutched photographs of fathers they barely remembered, and governments promised care for those carrying the weight of combat. But for many, the very institutions meant to heal them became sites of another kind of erasure. Their wounds were not met with patience or compassion, but with experiments designed to rewrite the mind itself. Dr. Ewan Cameron, a Scottish-born psychiatrist working in North America, emerged as a central figure in this hidden chapter. By the 1950s, he was conducting trials funded in part by covert government programs, later linked to MKUltra. His goal was not merely to treat trauma but to obliterate. It convinced the mind could be stripped of memory and rebuilt from the ground up. He called the process de-patterning. The methods were merciless. Patients were subjected to massive doses of electroshock far exceeding medical norms, repeated until memories shattered into fragments. Drugs, barbiturates, hallucinogens, sedatives were administered in brutal combinations, designed to erode resistance. Subjects were confined in sensory deprivation chambers, cut off from light, sound, and human contact for weeks at a time. Many emerged unable to recognize their own names, their families, or their pasts. Among these files, the case of Robert Loy stands apart. A decorated veteran, he had returned from Europe honored for bravery. Haunted by nightmares and sudden bursts of rage, his wife admitted him to a Montreal hospital, assured he would receive expert care. Within months, he was absorbed into Cameron's program. Records list dozens of shock sessions, injections of experimental compounds, and prolonged isolation. The man who returned to his family was unrecognizable. Robert no longer remembered his children. His speech fractured into repetitive fragments as if language itself had been dismantled. His wife pleaded for answers, but doctors offered only platitudes. Treatment takes time, progress requires patience. In reality, her husband had been reduced to a hollow shell by a program that treated memory as disposable. For the institution, these outcomes were not failures, but data points. Every collapse was logged, every erasure measured against the dream of rebuilding a blank mind. But reconstruction rarely came. Patients remained suspended in a fog, their past dissolved, their future unmoored. Families grieved in silence, mourning someone who was still alive, a presence without recognition. The betrayal lay in its secrecy. Veterans promised care for their sacrifice became unwitting test subjects in experiments fueled by ambition and hidden funding. They had survived the battlefield only to be dismantled in sterile hospital rooms, their identities fractured in the name of progress. Robert Loy's file closes with a final line, no longer suitable for reintegration. His medals remained polished, his name inscribed on military rolls, but the man himself had been undone by the country he served. The institution reduced him to a case study, another number in the long ledger of erased lives. The history of American asylums and hospitals cannot be untangled from the history of segregation. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, wards were divided by race. White patients received the faint promise of treatment, however limited, while black and indigenous patients were relegated to basements, annexes, or entirely separate institutions. Their pain was recorded differently if it was recorded at all, and their bodies were often chosen for procedures that others were spared. The work of Dr. J. Marion Sims illustrates this inequality most starkly. His name endures in medical texts as a pioneer of gynecology. Yet his methods rested on the repeated violation of enslaved women. Betsy, Lucy, and Anaka survive in fragments of his notes, their bodies opened again and again in experimental surgeries to repair injuries from childbirth. Sims carried out these operations without anesthesia, claiming it unnecessary, rationalizing their pain as tolerable because it was borne by black women. Anaka endured at least 30 such procedures. Each entry in Sims's records is coldly clinical adjustments in suturing changes in position outcomes described as encouraging. Her voice and the voices of the others never appear. What remains are the words of the surgeon whose authority erased the reality of their agony. Sims's rise to prominence was built on their silence. This pattern extended far beyond one surgeon. Inside asylums, black patients were confined to segregated wings, forced to use outdated equipment, and subjected to harsher restraints. Indigenous patients, when committed, were drawn into experiments framed as cultural correction, immersion in Euro-American routines, suppression of language, and tests with unproven sedatives. Institutional notes described them as uncooperative or resistant labels that justified further punishment. Their suffering was redefined as pathology, their resistance reframed as symptom. In later decades, testimonies began to surface. Survivors spoke of endless days of forced labor, cleaning, laundering, fieldwork extracted without pay, and justified as therapy. Others remembered the sting of needles delivering experimental drugs, their after effects unexplained. Families recalled loved ones admitted for minor troubles who returned, diminished, or never returned at all. The silence was systemic. Patients from marginalized groups were less likely to receive visitors, less likely to appear in newspapers, less likely to be remembered beyond an entry in an institutional ledger. Their names often reduced to a single initial, dissolved into statistics. Meanwhile, the scientific discoveries built on their endurance were celebrated stripped of the cost that made them possible. Only in recent years has recognition begun to surface. Monuments have been taken down, archives reopened, and the names of Betsy Lucy and Anaka spoken aloud as more than historical footnotes. Their survival is not measured in cures but in memory itself, persisting, despite every effort to erase it. The racial laboratory was never a single room, never confined to one doctor's practice. It was woven into the very structure of the system where inequality was built into the walls and medical advancement was measured against the suffering of those deemed expendable. Their silence enabled progress, but their survival ensured silence would never be absolute. For decades, America's asylum walls kept their secrets intact. Administrators controlled access, guarded the records, and assured families that silence was proof of care. But in the 1970s, fragments of truth began to break through. Reform did not come from within, it was forced from the outside by those willing to risk careers, reputations, and safety to expose what had long been hidden. The first rupture came through a camera lens. In 1972, journalist Geraldo Rivera entered Willowbrook State School on Staten Island, a facility built for children with developmental disabilities. What his camera found was not treatment, but abandonment. Narrow corridors overflowed with children, many unclothed, their bodies pressed against walls, stained with filth. Staff moved among them without urgency, their roles reduced to maintenance rather than care. Broadcast to millions. Rivera's footage shattered the polished language of annual reports. Families watching from their living rooms recognized scenes they had never been allowed to witness during carefully staged visits. The institution's facade cracked under the glare of the camera. Silence was broken not by testimony, but by the undeniable sight of suffering. Around the same time, another kind of exposure emerged from within. Dr. Michael Wilkins, a physician working in a state psychiatric hospital, began copying patient files in secret. He recorded routine abuses, experimental procedures carried out without consent, and deaths casually explained as natural when the details told otherwise. Smuggled out at great personal risk, these documents became the foundation for lawsuits and federal investigations. Unlike Rivera's shocking footage, Wilkins's leaks were not meant to move hearts, but to prove facts. They were the cold, irrefutable evidence that showed conditions exactly as they were. The files spoke with a chilling clarity. Signatures authorizing procedures that should never have been performed. Charts rewritten to conceal deaths. Reports documenting restraints not as treatment but as punishment. Piece by piece, the photographs and documents assembled into a truth too heavy to dismiss. The institutions answered with denial. Administrators claimed Rivera exaggerated painted Wilkins as a bitter dissenter and promised yet another round of internal reviews. But this time, The evidence could not be hidden in the shadows of bureaucracy. Public anger mounted, investigations were launched, and courts began to ask questions about the rights of those who had long been treated as voiceless wards. What set Rivera and Wilkins apart was not only their courage, but the shift they forced in perception. For the first time, the public was pressed to see patients not as nameless figures or statistics, but as sons and daughters, as human beings kept in conditions no family would tolerate. The secrecy that had shielded the asylum system for more than a century had been pierced. Rivera and Wilkins had opened a door that would never again close. The walls of the institution still stood, but the illusion of benevolence had been shattered. Once glimpsed, the truth could never be unseen. The silence that had protected cruelty was fractured by light. From that point onward, cracks ran through the walls impossible to repair. When the first images from Willowbrook reached the public, followed by leaked records confirming abuses elsewhere, officials could no longer dismiss the charges as isolated failures. The machinery of secrecy faltered, and pressure for accountability grew. Congressional hearings were called, bringing administrators, doctors, and survivors into the same rooms where reputations collided with the testimony of suffering. Senator Ted Kennedy emerged as one of the most visible figures in this reckoning. His hearings in the early 1970s drew national attention, gathering witnesses who had lived inside the institutions and those who had enforced their rules. In transcripts preserved today, Kennedy's voice cuts through the evasions of bureaucracy. He demanded numbers, explanations, responsibility. Behind him sat families clutching faded photographs of loved ones who had never come home. Among the witnesses was Anna Jennings, a woman who had survived years in a state hospital after being committed as a teenager. Her testimony came slowly, haltingly. She spoke of days strapped down, of shocks delivered without warning, of friends who vanished after sudden transfers never explained. Her words carried a quiet gravity that no report could erase. As she described a childhood swallowed by fear, the hearing room fell silent. Procedures she never understood had stolen years she would never recover. As the hearings dragged on, institutions scrambled to protect themselves. Files were removed from archives, records hastily rewritten, entire boxes of documents destroyed. Investigators reported arriving at hospitals only to find storage rooms emptied days before. The concealment itself became evidence, the truth buried, not in explanation but in absence. Yet fragments survived. Some were hidden by sympathetic staff, others overlooked in the rush to erase. These remnants revealed systemic abuse, sterilizations without consent, deaths quietly reclassified as natural budgets inflated by meaningless procedures designed only to secure funding. Each fragment added weight to survivors' voices, building a case that denial could not dissolve. The hearings did not dismantle the asylum system overnight, but they shifted its foundations. Administrators could no longer assure the public of benevolence without scrutiny. Reports faced questions, budgets required justification, and the testimony of patients once ignored began to carry legal authority. What had been sealed behind walls was now etched into congressional record, preserved in ink that could not be shredded. The very attempt to hide the truth revealed the desperation of a collapsing system. The shredded pages became symbols of an age when silence was manufactured, when truth was buried beneath layers of administrative language. Survivors like Anna Jennings made sure that what was meant to vanish endured. Out of these hearings, a new awareness was born. The asylum was no longer untouchable, its authority no longer absolute. The walls still stood, but the documents that had shielded them were torn apart. Voices that once echoed unheard now carried into the national record. Even after the hearings, after the hidden files surfaced and cameras carried images of suffering into homes across America, the story of the asylums did not end. Institutions were renamed, wards closed, treatments rebranded. Yet, the legacy lingered. It lived not only in survivors but in the structures themselves. The ghosts of the system endured not in superstition but in practices that refused to fully die. Patricia Deegan's life embodied this continuity. Diagnosed with schizophrenia as a teenager, she was told recovery was impossible. The treatments she received were blunt sedation confinement, enforced compliance. Yet Deegan emerged as one of the most powerful advocates for patient rights. Through her writing and testimony, she reframed patients not as subjects, but as citizens, insisting that dignity and autonomy replace silence and control. She reminded the nation that reform required vigilance. But even as advocates worked to rewrite the narrative, new evidence revealed that old patterns remained. David Chen, a lawyer specializing in mental health law, began collecting cases at the turn of the 21st century. His investigations showed that restraints and overmedication still haunted psychiatric wards, particularly in underfunded hospitals. He uncovered deaths labeled natural that echoed those from decades before, and families who fought for access to records still locked away behind bureaucratic doors. Chen's work proved that the past had not been buried, only repackaged. The laboratories and insulin comas were gone, but the ethos of control endured. Patients continued to disappear into institutions, their experiences reduced to files that rarely reached public view. The language softened, but the outcome was familiar silence, imposed autonomy, withheld. In this way, the asylum survives as both memory and structure. Even abandoned hospitals, their windows shattered and corridors overtaken by dust, seem to echo with what was once inside. Former patients who return to walk those grounds describe a haunting recognition: the weight of corridors, the clink of distant keys. Families speak of lost relatives as if they never fully returned, as though part of them remained confined within the walls.